Hello, welcome to Conway Video. In this video, I'd like to discuss an idea that I've been thinking about, which is the idea of conceptual limits, or minimizing concepts. And it's an idea that's I've been inspired. I've had sort of inspiration from several sources. So there's a book called The Philosophy of Software Design you may have heard of. That's been an influence. And there's another book called Clean Code, which you almost certainly have heard of, and that's also been an influence. And there's other books like The Design of Everyday Things and several other design books and just generally experience, I guess. And I guess the idea that basically it's a very simple idea. You don't even have to read any of these books to understand it. But it's basically the idea of a limit of concepts. It's the idea that as humans, we're limited creatures and we can often only focus on two or three things at once. And, some people can focus on more because they've just had that much experience and that much training and that much learning. And then also some people can switch very quickly. So it looks like they're focusing on 10 things at once. Actually, they're only focusing on two or three things at once, but they're very good at switching their focus. I'd say I'm one of those people myself, I get very good at kind of quickly moving my mind into one thing and then moving it to another and then moving it to another. And by doing that, I can actually end up dealing with a lot of different things. And it looks like I've got them all happening at once in parallel, but actually it's kind of more serial, it's this thing and then this thing and then this thing. But getting back to the idea, right? The idea is really conceptual limits. Thinking about the fact that there's a limited number of things we can focus on at once, and then applying that idea to code and to the way we design software. And the idea that I've really come to kind of converge on is that every module of your program, and by module I guess I mean it could be a function, it could be a class, it could be a file, it could be a group of files, but generally the thing that you look at when you look at code, you're going to be looking at some kind of module or grouping of code. So you're going to be looking at a function or a class or something. And the idea is that each of those things, if possible, should have a limited number of different concepts within it. And I think that might be the key to, or one of the keys to, unlocking this problem of software complexity. And the reason I say that is that if you can build your software in such a way that at any point that someone dives in and has a look at it, there's only a limited number of things they have to learn to understand it. Maybe they only have to learn 2 or 3 concepts instead of like 10. If you can design your software that way, then in theory, then it should be possible to work very easily with the software, because you should be able to go into any part of the software and quickly understand it and then start to work with it and change it, because you only need to understand those small number of concepts, 2 or 3 concepts. And so I actually think that this might be more important than the idea of keeping code small. So there's this idea everything should be small. So you should have small functions, short classes. And the problem I see with that is that if you make everything small and short, you still have to solve the problem. So there's still a certain amount of complexity that you just have to have. So what do you end up doing? Well, you end up having lots of little objects then. And is it really easier to understand 10 small classes than it is to understand, 1 or 2 really, really big classes? I don't think it's necessarily easier. So the solution I have is not to minimize the lines of code. I don't think lines of code matter a whole lot. I think, for example, most developers by now would agree that, the developer who writes more lines of code isn't necessarily the better developer, or, the number of lines of code in an application doesn't give you any indication of how good or useful or easy to work with that application is and that code is. So I don't think it's about the number of lines, and I don't think it's about making them shorter or longer, but I think it's about the number of concepts. If you can divide your code up in such a way that the number of concepts is more limited in each part, so that if I want to understand this part, I only need to deal with 3 concepts. And then if I want to then see this other part that's connected to it, I look at this other part, and also, again, I only have to understand 3 concepts. Then I think the code is easier to read. And I think you could have code that has many lines and is still small in concepts. So to give you an example, maybe you have a maybe you have a function, and as part of that function, it's got a table of different categories of, shall we say, I don't know, maybe it's got a table of different screen resolutions, and then different kind of different different layouts for each resolution. So when the screen is this size, then it should be this resolution. When it's that size, it should be that resolution, and so on. So if that's mainly what your function does, then it doesn't matter to me if you have like 5 different resolutions or 10 different resolutions or 20 different resolutions, because think of it from the user's perspective, from the perspective of the person who's going in and looking at the code to understand it. They don't need to understand every single resolution separately. They only need to understand the concept. They only need to understand that one concept of, oh, this is a map of resolutions to layouts. Like, I just need to understand what the resolution means and what the layout means, and then I can just use that knowledge to understand the whole list of them. And so all of a sudden you have 100, maybe 200 lines of code, but it's so easy to understand because it's such a simple concept that someone can quickly, just look at one item and then understand the whole thing. And so I think that if your code is structured in that kind of way, where each unit or each module of the code only deals with 1, 2, or 3 concepts, then it's going to be very easy for a developer to come in and understand what that code does. And even if the code gets bigger and longer, as long as it's limiting itself to those 2 or 3 concepts, then it's going to be easy to understand. And so I guess that's my general rule is, or something I'm trying to adopt these days, is to try to limit the number of concepts. And if a piece of code is doing so many different things that you need to understand like 10 or 20 different things in order to understand what that code does, I think that's a good candidate for stepping back and refactoring that code. And maybe it could mean dividing a function up into different sections with comment headers in each. Maybe it could mean dividing it up into other functions, abstracting away some of the things into other functions. Maybe it means rethinking the whole design and thinking, does this function even need to do all these things? Maybe it only really needs to do one thing, and I can actually make it less, remove some capability, and it doesn't have to do those things. But always thinking about reducing the number of concepts, so that when I've finished with my function, I want someone new to be able to come in, look at that function, and only have to learn maybe 2 or 3 new things, and then they're good to go. They understand the function, and then they know where to make a change, or they know how to test it, or whatnot. So yeah, that's the idea. Don't try and reduce lines of code necessarily. Don't try and reduce the number of objects necessarily. The sweet spot is reduce concepts. Less concepts, fewer concepts, and hopefully then that leads to cleaner, readable, maintainable code. Thank you.